Welcome to another deep dive into the life of one of the most powerful and controversial figures of our time. Today, we're going to explore the story of Vladimir Putin, a man who rose from the shadows of the KGB to become the leader of modern Russia. Whether you admire his strategic genius or criticize his iron-fisted rule, one thing is certain: Putin has left an undeniable mark on history. But who is he really? How did a young boy from Leningrad navigate the brutal political landscape of post-Soviet Russia and secure a grip on power that has lasted for decades? What forces shaped him, and what legacy will he leave behind? His life is a fascinating mix of calculated moves, intense secrecy, and ruthless ambition. From his early days as a KGB agent to his controversial leadership, his story is one of survival, power, and influence. This is more than just a biography. This is a journey through the mind of a man who has defined Russian politics for over 2 decades. We will uncover his origins, his rise to power, his policies, his conflicts, and his ultimate impact on the world. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our in-depth explorations into history's most fascinating personalities. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg. His early years were marked by hardship and resilience, growing up in a city that had been devastated by World War II. The siege of Leningrad had left deep scars on its people, and Putin's own family was no exception. His father, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, was a factory worker and a war veteran who had been severely wounded while fighting against Nazi Germany. His mother, Maria Ivanovna, had survived near starvation during the siege. These experiences shaped the young Vladimir, instilling in him a deep sense of patriotism and an understanding of the brutal realities of survival. As a child, Putin was described as both quiet and fiercely determined. He was not the strongest boy in school, but he had a fiery temper and a drive to assert himself. This led him to take up judo and sambo, martial arts that would become a lifelong passion. Through these disciplines, he learned not just physical strength, but also strategy, patience, and the ability to read his opponents, skills that would later prove essential in his political career. Even as a teenager, he had a fascination with power and control. Unlike most children who dreamed of becoming astronauts or athletes, Putin had a different goal: he wanted to be a spy. His obsession with espionage led him to the KGB headquarters in Leningrad when he was just 16 years old. He walked in and boldly asked how he could join. The officers told him that the KGB didn't take volunteers, and that if he truly wanted to be an intelligence officer, he would need a law degree. Determined, Putin adjusted his course and enrolled in Leningrad State University, where he studied law and specialized in international affairs. He became known as a diligent student, though he was never the top of his class. His real education, however, came outside the classroom. While at university, he was recruited by the KGB, fulfilling his childhood dream. By the time he graduated in 1975, he was already training as an intelligence officer. His career in the KGB was not as glamorous as one might expect. He was stationed in Dresden, East Germany, during the Cold War, where he worked in counterintelligence and gathered information on Western nations. Unlike the dramatic world of spies depicted in movies, his work was often bureaucratic, involving the recruitment of informants and the management of intelligence files. Still, it gave him a deep understanding of deception, secrecy, and manipulation, tools he would later use in politics. His time in East Germany gave him a front-row seat to the decline of the Soviet Union. He saw firsthand how communist regimes struggled to maintain control, and he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, an event that shook him deeply. He later recalled that in the chaos of the collapse, he and his fellow KGB officers burned sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. For Putin, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not just a political event, it was a personal humiliation, a sign that the system he had devoted himself to was crumbling. When he returned to Leningrad in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was in free fall, and his career in the KGB was effectively over. He briefly worked at Leningrad State University, but his ambitions had shifted. He was about to enter a new world, one that required a different kind of intelligence. He was about to step into politics. When Vladimir Putin returned to Leningrad in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was collapsing. The country was in chaos, its economy was crumbling, crime and corruption were rampant, and political instability was at an all-time high. The once powerful USSR was dissolving into independent republics, and in the midst of this turmoil, Putin was searching for his next move. He had left the KGB, but his skills in intelligence, strategy, and manipulation would soon find a new purpose. Putin's entry into politics came through an old connection. His former professor from Leningrad State University, Anatoly Sobchak, had become the mayor of the city and needed people he could trust. Putin, with his disciplined work ethic and experience in intelligence, was brought on as an advisor and later promoted to deputy mayor. This was his first real taste of power in the political arena. Though he remained in the background, he quickly became one of Sobchak's most trusted men. During this period, Putin was in charge of foreign relations and economic affairs for the city. This meant he had control over licensing businesses, foreign trade deals, and government contracts, an invaluable position at a time when Russia's economy was transitioning from communism to capitalism. This period was also filled with controversy. Many deals made under Putin's watch were later accused of being corrupt, favoring certain business elites, and allegedly allowing organized crime to flourish. But in the unstable Russia of the early 1990s, such dealings were common. Putin's loyalty to Sobchak was unwavering. When the mayor lost his re-election bid in 1996, Putin refused to switch sides, a move that cost him his job. For a brief period, he was unemployed and uncertain about his future. But his reputation, as a disciplined and reliable administrator, had caught the attention of powerful figures in Moscow. That same year, he was offered a position in Boris Yeltsin's presidential administration. He accepted and moved to the capital, beginning the next stage of his ascent. In Moscow, Putin quickly climbed the ranks. He took on roles in the Kremlin's management, overseeing various departments and earning a reputation as someone who was efficient, loyal, and, perhaps most importantly, discreet. Unlike many of Yeltsin's other officials, Putin didn't seek the limelight. He was a man of few words, careful with his public image, and always calculating his next move. By 1998, Yeltsin appointed him as the director of the Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor agency to the KGB. This was a crucial moment in Putin's rise. Leading the FSB gave him access to intelligence networks, control over surveillance, and deep insight into the workings of Russia's power structure. In this role, he strengthened his alliances with key figures in law enforcement and the military, connections that would prove invaluable in the years to come. His rise continued at an astonishing pace. In 1999, Yeltsin, whose health was failing and whose presidency was plagued by scandal, needed a successor. The Russian government was unstable, and the country needed a leader who could project strength and control. Putin, with his composed demeanor and intelligence background, was seen as the perfect candidate. In August 1999, he was appointed Prime Minister of Russia. Though he was still relatively unknown to the public, the political elite knew that he was being groomed for something bigger. Then came a pivotal moment. On December 31, 1999, in a shocking televised announcement, Boris Yeltsin resigned as president, naming Vladimir Putin as his successor. Just like that, on the eve of the new millennium, an ex-KGB officer with little public political experience became the acting president of Russia. Few could have predicted just how long he would remain in power, or how dramatically he would reshape the country. As the year 2000 began, Russia was in crisis. The country was reeling from the economic collapse of the 1990s, the war in Chechnya was raging, and corruption had seeped into every level of government. Vladimir Putin, now acting president, had to prove himself quickly. Many saw him as a temporary figure, a placeholder until the next election. But they underestimated him. In just a few months, he made it clear that he wasn't just filling a seat, he was taking control. His first move was to establish order. One of his primary campaign promises was to bring stability to Russia, and he wasted no time doing so. He took a hardline approach to the ongoing Chechen conflict, launching a brutal military campaign that crushed separatist forces. His decisive action in Chechnya helped solidify his image as a strong leader, someone who would restore Russia's power and prestige after the humiliation of the 1990s. However, this came at a heavy cost. Thousands of civilians were killed, and human rights organizations accused Russia of war crimes. Yet for many Russians, what mattered most was that Putin had restored control. At the same time, he began consolidating power domestically. Under Yeltsin, Russia had operated under a chaotic, semi-democratic system where oligarchs wielded enormous influence. Putin changed that. He targeted some of the country's most powerful businessmen, making it clear that their wealth and power would not protect them if they challenged the Kremlin. The most famous example was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the billionaire owner of the oil giant Yukos. Once one of Russia's richest men, Khodorkovsky was arrested in 2003 on charges of tax fraud and sentenced to prison. The message was clear: under Putin, no one was above the law, except for Putin himself. At the same time, he brought stability to the economy. He capitalized on rising oil prices, using Russia's vast energy resources to fuel economic growth. Under his leadership, Russia's GDP surged, poverty rates declined, and the middle class expanded. After years of economic turmoil, many Russians felt a renewed sense of pride. This economic success became one of the cornerstones of his popularity. He presented himself as the man who had rescued Russia from chaos, and for a time, many believed him. But stability came at a price. As Putin tightened his grip on power, democratic institutions weakened. Independent media outlets were shut down or taken over by pro-Kremlin forces. Journalists who criticized the government faced threats, imprisonment, or worse, several high-profile reporters were mysteriously killed, including Anna Politkovskaya, a vocal critic of Putin's war in Chechnya. Opposition parties were systematically dismantled, and political rivals found themselves either in exile, in prison, or worse. Despite these controversies, Putin remained immensely popular among many Russians. His image as a decisive, strong leader contrasted sharply with the weak and chaotic leadership of the 1990s. He cultivated a persona of toughness. He was frequently seen engaging in activities like judo, horseback riding, and even diving into the sea to discover ancient artifacts, an event later revealed to have been staged. The message was clear: Putin was not just a politician, he was a man of action, a leader who embodied Russian strength and resilience. By 2008, he had reached a constitutional roadblock. Russian law prevented a president from serving more than 2 consecutive terms, meaning he had to step down. Instead of leaving politics, he orchestrated a carefully planned move. He handpicked Dmitry Medvedev as his successor, who, once elected, appointed Putin as prime minister. For 4 years, Medvedev held the title of president, but few doubted who was really in charge. In 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, having changed the constitution to extend presidential terms from 4 to 6 years. His return sparked massive protests in Moscow, with thousands taking to the streets to demand fair elections. The government responded with force, cracking down on dissent and arresting opposition leaders. It became clear that Putin was no longer just a president, he was building a system where he could remain in power indefinitely. As his second presidency continued, his leadership took an increasingly aggressive turn. He challenged the West more openly, asserting Russia's influence in global politics. In 2014, he made his most audacious move yet, annexing Crimea from Ukraine. The world reacted with outrage, imposing sanctions on Russia. But inside the country, his approval ratings soared. To many Russians, Crimea was historically theirs, and Putin's move was seen as a bold act of reclaiming lost territory. But this move also set Russia on a collision course with the West. The annexation of Crimea and Russia's involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine led to a deterioration of relations with the US and Europe. Sanctions began to take a toll on the economy, and political tensions escalated. Yet despite these challenges, Putin showed no signs of backing down. His message was clear: Russia would not be dictated to by the West. As Putin's rule continued, his policies became more nationalistic, his government more authoritarian, and his grip on power stronger than ever. But with growing unrest, increasing opposition, and mounting international pressure, the question remained: how long could he maintain his hold over Russia? When Vladimir Putin first took office in 2000, Russia was a country in disarray. The economy had collapsed after the Soviet Union's fall, military morale was at an all-time low, and on the global stage, Russia was often treated as a shadow of its former self. Putin's promise was clear: he would restore Russia's strength, bring stability, and reclaim its status as a great power. Over the next 2 decades, he took dramatic steps to fulfill that vision, reshaping Russia's economy, military, and international standing, though not without controversy. One of Putin's most significant achievements was stabilizing Russia's economy. During the 1990s, the country had suffered a deep recession, hyperinflation, and a massive loss of public trust in financial institutions. Under Putin, Russia's economy initially flourished. The key to this turnaround was oil and gas. Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers, and Putin skillfully used its vast natural resources to fuel economic growth. As global oil prices soared in the early 2000s, Russia's GDP grew rapidly, wages increased, and poverty rates declined. With economic strength came political leverage. Putin used Russia's energy resources as a geopolitical weapon, particularly in Europe, where many countries depended on Russian gas. By controlling supply and pricing, he ensured that Russia remained an indispensable player in global energy markets. However, this strategy also had risks. When oil prices fell, or when countries sought alternative energy sources, Russia's economy struggled. Despite this, Putin continued to push for energy dominance, using state-owned companies like Gazprom to expand Russia's influence. But economic growth was not enough. To truly restore Russia's power, Putin believed the country needed a strong military. Throughout his rule, he poured billions into modernizing the armed forces, increasing defense spending significantly. Under his leadership, the Russian military transitioned from a struggling, outdated force into a modernized war machine. He introduced new weapons systems, improved training programs, and strengthened Russia's nuclear capabilities. This build-up was not just for defense. It was a clear message to the world that Russia was once again a military power to be reckoned with. Putin demonstrated this new military strength on multiple occasions. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, swiftly defeating its military and asserting dominance over the region. Then, in 2014, came the annexation of Crimea, a move that shocked the West and led to a deep geopolitical crisis. While Western nations condemned the action and imposed sanctions, inside Russia, Putin's popularity soared. To many Russians, Crimea's annexation was a symbol of national pride, a moment where their country reclaimed what they believed was rightfully theirs. But the Crimea crisis was just the beginning. In 2015, Putin ordered Russian military intervention in Syria, supporting President Bashar al-Assad's government against rebel forces. This move not only secured Russia's influence in the Middle East, but also positioned Putin as a key player on the global stage, able to challenge the dominance of the United States and NATO. Russia's military actions in Syria were ruthless, leading to widespread accusations of war crimes. Yet, from a strategic standpoint, the intervention was a success. It kept Assad in power, strengthened Russia's ties with Iran, and expanded Russia's naval presence in the Mediterranean. As Russia grew bolder, relations with the West deteriorated further. The United States and European nations imposed more sanctions, targeting Russian banks, businesses, and political elites. These sanctions hurt the economy, but they did not weaken Putin's resolve. Instead, they reinforced his narrative that the West was Russia's enemy, an external threat trying to undermine the country's sovereignty. This rhetoric played well at home, fueling nationalism and justifying his increasingly authoritarian policies. Meanwhile, Russia intensified its use of cyber warfare and disinformation campaigns to influence global politics. Western intelligence agencies accused Russia of meddling in elections, including the 2016 U.S. presidential race. Putin's government denied these allegations, but the evidence of Russian interference became overwhelming. Cyberattacks, propaganda, and state-sponsored hacking became key tools in Russia's strategy to destabilize its rivals while strengthening its own position. Despite growing opposition at home and abroad, Putin continued to tighten his grip on power. By suppressing dissent, controlling the media, and silencing critics, he ensured that he remained the undisputed leader of Russia. But as his rule extended into its third decade, cracks began to appear. Economic stagnation, growing public unrest, and an increasingly isolated foreign policy raised questions about the future. Could Putin maintain his hold on Russia indefinitely, or was his empire beginning to weaken? The world watched closely as the Russian leader, once seen as a stabilizing force, became an increasingly unpredictable and controversial figure. His legacy was being written in real time, shaped by wars, political conflicts, and an ever-growing tension between Russia and the rest of the world. The next chapter of his rule would be defined not just by his actions, but by how the Russian people, and the world, chose to respond. Despite Vladimir Putin's firm grip on power, his leadership has never been without opposition. From the very beginning of his presidency, there were those who saw him as an authoritarian leader consolidating control at the expense of democracy. Over the years, opposition voices have grown louder, protests have erupted, and internal crises have tested his ability to maintain absolute authority. But time and again, Putin has responded with a combination of suppression, manipulation, and strategic concessions to ensure his dominance. In the early years of his rule, political opposition was relatively weak. The chaotic 1990s had left many Russians disillusioned with democracy, making Putin's promise of stability and order appealing to the majority. However, as he tightened control over the media and crushed independent political movements, opposition figures began to emerge as vocal critics of his administration. One of the earliest and most notable was Boris Nemtsov, a former deputy prime minister, who became a fierce critic of Putin's policies, particularly regarding corruption and human rights abuses. Nemtsov was a leading figure in organizing protests, but his voice was silenced in 2015, when he was assassinated near the Kremlin in a murder widely believed to have been politically motivated. Another key opposition figure was Alexei Navalny, a lawyer and anti-corruption activist, who gained prominence by exposing high-level government corruption through online investigations. His reports, which detailed the vast wealth accumulated by Putin's inner circle, resonated with many Russians frustrated by economic inequality and government dishonesty. Navalny's popularity surged, and he became one of the few opposition leaders capable of mobilizing large-scale protests. Putin's government responded to Navalny's activism with increasing repression. He was repeatedly arrested, barred from running for office, and ultimately poisoned in 2020 with a military-grade nerve agent. Although he survived and recovered in Germany, upon his return to Russia in 2021, he was immediately arrested and sentenced to prison on politically motivated charges. His imprisonment sparked international outrage and mass protests across Russia, but the Kremlin's crackdown on dissent was swift and brutal. Thousands of demonstrators were arrested, independent media outlets were shut down, and laws were passed to criminalize support for opposition movements. Beyond political opposition, Putin has also faced challenges from Russian society itself. The economic prosperity of the early 2000s gave way to stagnation in the 2010s, with falling oil prices and Western sanctions weakening the economy. As living standards declined, dissatisfaction grew, especially among younger Russians, who had no memory of the turbulent 1990s, and were less inclined to accept Putin's narrative of stability at any cost. The internet and social media provided a platform for alternative viewpoints, making it harder for the government to control the flow of information. Corruption remained one of the biggest issues fueling public anger. While Putin maintained an image of strength and control, the reality was that Russia was still plagued by systemic corruption at all levels of government. Oligarchs and high-ranking officials amassed enormous wealth, while ordinary citizens struggled with rising prices and stagnant wages. The perception that Putin's government served the elite rather than the people only deepened resentment among those who felt left behind. One of the most significant internal crises of Putin's rule came in 2011 to 2012, when massive protests erupted following parliamentary elections widely seen as rigged. The demonstrations, which brought tens of thousands of people to the streets, marked the largest challenge to Putin's authority up to that point. Although the protests eventually lost momentum, they revealed a growing dissatisfaction with the political system. In response, Putin cracked down harder on dissent, passing laws restricting public demonstrations and labeling NGOs and activists as foreign agents. In recent years, Russia's political climate has become even more repressive. Independent journalism has been virtually eliminated, with media outlets that criticize the government being forced to shut down or operate from exile. Civil society organizations have been dismantled, and laws restricting freedom of speech have expanded dramatically. The government's surveillance capabilities have also increased, allowing authorities to monitor and control dissent more effectively than ever before. Despite these challenges, Putin remains in power. His ability to outmaneuver opponents, control the narrative, and use state institutions to his advantage has allowed him to maintain a tight grip on Russia. However, the future remains uncertain. Economic hardships, an increasingly restless younger generation, and growing discontent within the ruling elite could eventually pose a serious threat to his rule. For now, Putin continues to present himself as the ultimate defender of Russia, portraying any opposition as part of a Western-backed conspiracy to weaken the country. But history has shown that no leader, no matter how powerful, can remain unchallenged forever. The question is not if opposition to Putin will grow, but whether it will ever be strong enough to truly threaten his reign. As Vladimir Putin enters his third decade in power, his legacy remains one of the most polarizing in modern history. To some, he is the man who restored Russia's pride, rebuilt its economy, and asserted its dominance on the world stage. To others, he is a ruthless authoritarian who has crushed dissent, eroded democracy, and led Russia into international isolation. Regardless of perspective, one thing is clear: his influence on Russia and global politics is profound and will be felt for generations to come. One of Putin's most lasting impacts is the transformation of Russia's political system. When he first took office, Russia was an unstable democracy, with competing political factions and a free press that often criticized those in power. Under his leadership, that system has been systematically dismantled. Political opposition has been suppressed, independent media has been eliminated, and the rule of law has been bent to serve the interests of the Kremlin. Russia is no longer considered a democracy by most political analysts. Instead, it is seen as a highly centralized state where power is concentrated in the hands of one man. His economic legacy is more complex. While he initially stabilized the economy and lifted millions of Russians out of poverty, his reliance on oil and gas exports left the country vulnerable. Western sanctions following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and later international conflicts severely weakened Russia's economy. As a result, the economic prosperity that defined his early years in power has given way to stagnation, inflation, and a decline in living standards. While Putin often blames external forces for these difficulties, many economists argue that his failure to modernize Russia's economy has left it dangerously dependent on energy exports. On the world stage, Putin has positioned Russia as a counterweight to Western influence. His foreign policy has been defined by a desire to restore Russia's status as a global power, often through military intervention and geopolitical maneuvering. From the annexation of Crimea to military operations in Syria, his actions have reshaped international relations, forcing Western nations to reconsider their approach to Russia. However, these actions have also led to severe diplomatic isolation. Once a country with strong economic and political ties to Europe and the United States, Russia is now more dependent on alliances with China, Iran, and other nations that challenge Western dominance. Perhaps the most significant question regarding Putin's legacy is what happens after he is gone. Over the years, he has built a system so centered around himself that it is unclear who could replace him without destabilizing the country. He has altered the Russian constitution to allow him to remain in power until at least 2036, but no leader rules forever. What happens when Putin is no longer in control? Will his successor continue his policies, or will Russia undergo a dramatic transformation? The uncertainty surrounding this transition could define Russia's political future for decades. Despite all the controversy, one cannot deny that Putin has left an indelible mark on history. He has outlasted multiple US presidents, reshaped Russia into a formidable force, and maintained a grip on power unmatched by any Russian leader since the Soviet era. His rule has been defined by strength, strategy, and suppression. Some will remember him as the leader who restored Russia's greatness, while others will see him as the man who sacrificed freedom for power. As the world watches Russia's future unfold, one question remains: will Putin be remembered as a master strategist who secured Russia's place in history, or as an autocrat whose grip on power ultimately weakened the nation? His legacy is still being written, but what do you think?